It was supposed to be a fun vacation romance. 29-year-old Zaliya Shamigulova was enjoying her summer vacation on a paradise island when she decided to swipe right on Tinder. What followed was the unimaginable, her disappearance, and later the discovery of her body. She'd been murdered, stabbed to death, but what's more, her tongue had been cut out, apparently so she couldn't yell for help.
The removing of a tongue has often happened as a way of punishment for betrayal or lying.
And that's the motive, betrayal, because apparently Zaliya's Tinder date got jealous when she was interested in another guy. Before we go too far into the specifics of this case, let's focus on the most important facts. 29-year-old Zaliya was a university lecturer from Russia, and she was vacationing on the African island of Mauritius. It's a tropical vacation destination about 700 miles east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. Zaliya was last seen on August 17th, wearing a white and blue dress, getting into a blue Toyota on the island. She was leaving her rental apartment, and a local man was giving her a ride. But when she didn't return back to her rental apartment, the friend she was traveling with reported her missing. Around this same time, Zaliya's family started getting some pretty strange messages from her phone, saying things like Zaliya was going off the grid, she was disappearing on purpose, and she didn't want any more contact with her family. That didn't seem right to them or her friend, and as the investigation continued, it soon pointed in the direction of her Tinder date. That's this guy, 29-year-old Puryavirsingh Sundur, an IT engineer who is an islander. Investigators say he and Zaliya connected on Tinder, but here's where the facts diverge. Some reports say they met before she made it to the island, and others say they only connected when she arrived. But either way, we do know that they matched on Tinder and were confirmed to be together. And it was Sundur who gave investigators more details about Zaliya's murder because he admitted to it. Investigators found some blood in his car, and after that, he led them to an area of the island called La Marie, just a 25-minute drive from the part of the island where Zaliya and her friend were staying. There, Sundur led law enforcement to a shallow grave where Zaliya's body was left behind. She was naked and had multiple stab wounds. Sundur admitted to mutilating Zaliya's body and even cutting out her tongue. He says this was so she couldn't scream for help. All this happened on August 22nd, just 5 days after Zaliya first disappeared. And according to Sundur, the motive for her murder was that Zaliya was apparently unfaithful to him, that she cheated on him with someone else. Sundur told detectives he loved her and even planned to marry her and that she betrayed him. So he pretended like he was going to take her sightseeing and instead pulled out a knife and stabbed her to death. To make sense of the case as we know it right now, I reached out to retired police commander and host of the Profiling Evil podcast, Mike King.
Clearly, the victim in this case took a great deal of risk, and it's not victim shaming. But when we choose to do things like this, we increase our level of risk. Meeting someone online is inherently more dangerous than meeting someone through relationships that you have with other people, because it's the unknown introduced into this. And so when I think about these things that aren't being said, my mind starts racing toward who is this man who has murdered this woman. It's really interesting to me, the process and the actual steps that he took along the way, and were they really consistent with someone who all of a sudden was outraged because they felt like their newfound love had cheated on them, or was it some predatory behavior, and that is what then groomed and brought this woman to the island where he could act out his fantasies. So I find myself shifting back and forth between the victimology, the study of who the victim is, and the suspectology. And what is it in his past? What is it about his previous behaviors that would be predictive of what happened in this particular case, if in fact that can be resolved?
The story we're talking about today, Zaliya's story, is a really gruesome one, and honestly hard to talk about at all. But I do think it's important to tell her story and to keep her memory alive. And one of the ways I'm able to do that is because of our sponsors. One of our sponsors is City Lips, and I recently started using the product and I actually really like it. I'm big on makeup, as you can see, and this one fit right easily into my repertoire. My favorite thing is there's a shade for every single occasion, whether I'm just hanging out or I have to go on air. And on top of that, it's moisturizing, so you never have to worry about your lips getting dry. Right now, you can get 15% off City Lips with the code LAW15, or go to citybeauty.com/LCnews. But let's start with the victim in this case. You kind of referred to this about meeting someone on Tinder, how that is definitely more dangerous than meeting someone, whether it's a friend of a friend or a coworker, whatever it may be. But this, I feel like, is even more heightened because she's on vacation. So she meets this guy on a holiday romance, which sounds great, like a romantic comedy, but then things get a little bit more stressful as this progresses. I mean, how would you stay safe if you're going to meet up with somebody on this island? You don't know him, you don't know his background. Is that just dangerous in general?
Oh, well, personally, from a criminologist perspective, it's absolutely more dangerous. And again, this is not an attack on the victim, and I hope everyone who's listening understands this is not about anything to do with shaming the victim. It's about risk reduction, and the fact that this individual chose to assume more risk by going there. Now, I've read conflicting reports. One that suggests there may have been a couple of weeks of online bantering going back and forth. I don't know if that included online video chats, but it appeared that there was more of a online digital relationship created before she came, and that may have in part motivated the trip. I could be completely wrong too, because I've heard the opposite of just like you've mentioned, that she meets this guy on the island. That's even more frightening to me, if in fact she meets someone that is so controlling that she agrees, I'm going to go on a sightseeing trip with him anyway, unless he was just, as part of his fantasy, grooming and preparing her, and she thought, oh, here's a nice Uber driver and I'm going to go for a ride with him.
Almost right away after Zaliya's disappearance, there were some blatant signs that something was off. I think the next thing that really jumped out to me is that her family back home in Russia, where she's from, started to receive text messages from her that basically said, I'm hoping to disappear. Do not contact me again. I don't want to be in contact with you. This seemed to be out of character. I mean, she usually would keep in touch with her family. She was very active on social media, posting about her trips and her adventures. So, is that a red flag right from the jump?
Absolutely. And we see this happen in many cases where a predator takes control of a victim and their phone, and it's a way to buy time to go in and manipulate the phone. So, what becomes important in the interview process is that the past behavior of this individual is really understood. And that's where interviews with the family, looking at her social media accounts, looking at her just regular text messages on her phone, gives you this sense of what this person's activity is and how much they're willing to expose in a public light. And then just look at the conversations with the loved ones that received this distressing note to say, is this the way she usually talks? And most often we can see that it was more reflective of the predator's way of speaking and presenting things. The thing I find interesting is I don't know if her communications were in Russian. I would assume so. And does that mean that his communication was in Russian? So was he using a translator service like Google Translate and putting in this rudimentary language that just tries to hit the key points of no longer reach out to me, I want to get away? And so all of those things from an investigative standpoint really start to paint the picture of what the behaviors were at the time she disappeared, and maybe during those hours or days immediately following her disappearance.
So we have those red flags from the family, these messages that just don't seem to add up with their family member that they know. And eventually she doesn't come back to the rental house that she was sharing with a friend. So her friend then reports her missing. This is really scary to me because I do travel with my friends many times. I was just in Europe with them. And if one of us goes missing, it's a little more distressing because we don't know the customs there. We might not even know the language. How do they go about then communicating with the law enforcement officials that are there and making sure to convey all the information they have as they're searching for, at the time, a missing person?
Yeah, as soon as something like that happens, and they reach out to their individual equivalent of our State Department, they would then get the services as someone who is a patriot on foreign soil, which would include some investigative and some translation service. Law enforcement generally, in the US, I think we're a little luckier because much of the world has people who speak English. I don't know if on that little island if they have people that speak Russian. So that becomes an immediate challenge. And where are you going to find the resource to help you navigate that and question people? Um, when you think about the idea of this individual just jumping in a car and going for a ride with a boy she met or had previously created a relationship with, regardless, one of the things that I often say, and when we travel, and we travel extensively with another couple throughout the world, and we make sure that we all have each other's phones on our phones so that we can go to the location they are. And if we decide to split up for the day, we say, I'm going here and I'll be back at this time. And you have this sense of security and being able to look on your app and say, oh yeah, they're where they said they were. And if things go wrong, you have a breadcrumb trail to follow, which may have led to her discovery more quickly. Certainly, in the way that she was murdered, wouldn't have probably led to saving her, but at least discovering her more quickly.
As we know, it was Sundar who led investigators to Zaliya's body, and the scene was shocking. It is one of the more gruesome cases I've heard in recent history, just the way that she died. She was found naked, which into itself is very vulnerable. Then she was murdered, but this is the part that really stuck out with me. Her tongue was cut out of her mouth. Later, we learn the suspect allegedly says it's so that she can't scream for help. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that's a bunch of malarkey as far as screaming for help because she could still vocalize. The tongue doesn't make the noise, it's the lungs and pushing out through the vocal cords. And someone that's going through that would certainly make horrendous cries from agony as they're going through this. So there were a couple of things that troubled me about that. Particularly that was something that he might have said as a way to justify more of a fantasy that was going on in his mind.
As King explains, there could be a few reasons behind why the suspect would remove Zaliya's tongue.
You know, I've done a little bit of studying on the island of Mauritius and looking at some of the cultural and symbolic implications of cutting tongues out. And I can't really see a whole lot other than historically, there and throughout history, the removing of a tongue has often happened as a way of punishment for betrayal or lying. And of course, he tips his hand that he feels like he was betrayed and that she was having an affair and that he did this. But with the stab wounds in a location that really talks about the anger inside him, and it would be interesting to see the manner in which her tongue was removed. And these are all the gruesome parts that investigators really kind of roll in the dirt and try to understand. It helps us understand, was this an effort to silence her? Or is it an effort to punish her for this perceived wrong that she's committed with him? Is there cultural or ritual context to what they're doing? Is it a ritual crime in nature and part of a fantasy that's going on in the predator's mind where this would be really cool and they think about it till they can't stand it anymore and they have to act it out? And this is terrifying when you think about predatory behavior, but I spent a career dealing with these people. Or was it truly just a way to silence her?
But the way Zaliya's body was found naked in a shallow grave, that's also important for investigators to consider. Here's King to explain why.
But when you see a body that has been stripped of its clothing, if it's posed and she's buried, which kind of muddies the water a little bit, but if she were left out, displayed, posed with no clothing on, with her tongue removed, those are all things that the predator sends a strong message with. What this speaks to more to me, frankly, is a very disorganized predator who committed a murder, probably was a sexually driven fantasy murder, that he did all of these things, but then he tries to do what we did as kids, do the do-over and make things go away. And so he buries her and tries to get on with what's going on in his life. Doesn't want to mess with that anymore. All of those factors to me lead more toward disorganization than this predator who really has planned this crime out.
As far as the way that she was found in this shallow grave, she was naked, obviously had traumatic injuries to her body. But one of the things I saw is that investigators were searching for her clothes. That was a question mark in my mind. When they find her clothes, what would that do? I mean, they've already pretty much determined how she died. Why do they need the clothes? Just for extra evidence?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The clothing might have physical DNA from the suspect or from her. And as a profiler, one of the things that we always looked at was not just the fact that, for instance, a sexual assault or a homicide occurred, but what was the order of those things? What were the things that were going on before that? And in kind of a creepy Silence of the Lambs kind of a way, you have to think about, to a profiler, we want to know things like, did he cut her clothing off? And was that symbolic or in a ritualistic kind of a fashion? Because that tells us what's going on in the mind. But again, I go back to this idea of a little bit of disorganization, because in the end, what he does is he buries this woman just to the east of where they meet up, out on the western coast. And there are a lot of areas on that island that would have been easier to dispose of a body and not have it discovered than near a residential area, which again speaks back to me to a little bit of the disorganization going on. It could be that this is just an incredibly hot-headed, overbearing, controlling human being who just snapped at whatever he perceived to be his reality, and he committed this homicide. But not many people commit homicides that look like this that haven't had predisposed kinds of cases just like it, or at least fantasized about it, acted out on animals or other kinds of things.
All this brings us to why Zaliya was murdered. Apparently, what the motive in this case is that the alleged perpetrator was having a relationship with the victim and she stepped out on their relationship, whether it was an affair or cheating or whatever. The thing that really stood out to me, though, is that this is supposedly a romance on a vacation. So it's not like they've been together for 10 years and they're this married couple. I mean, I know it hurts your feelings when somebody would cheat on you, but this is a very short romance, so to speak. So is that possible that he really got that angry after they've been together for less than a month? Or could there be a different motive?
Yeah, I have to agree with you. And I think that's really insightful to look at it from that perspective, because, again, you want to think about what the motivation is for the crime. If it's just a sexually driven fantasy that he's acting out, again, you have to consider, is there grooming going on to get the victim here? But that creates a great deal of risk for the predator, because there's now a digital footprint, people who have seen his photograph, perhaps her friend who sees her getting picked up. All of those things are really kind of tricky. And I'm with you in the idea that it doesn't make sense that they would have met over the first couple of days of her being on the island, and that he now has established this hold on her, unless she somehow is going along with the fantasy that, oh, we've created something magical together.
I agree with you because she also was supposed to go to Madagascar on September 1st, which is just right around the corner. So it's not like she's going to be on this island forever, permanently moving. So that kind of got me thinking that potentially this motive might not be it. And if that's the case, it isn't this lover's quarrel that went bad. Potentially, could it have been that he was seeking someone out to murder them? And then that gets me thinking, is it possible that investigators, now that they have him, would go through and take a look at other crimes that had happened on the island to see if whether he might be responsible or know about them?
Yeah, exactly. Prudence would say you have to do that anyway. You've got to look at all of your unsolved cases and try to figure out, is there a nexus between this predator and those victims? And you're right. The fact that she comes here, if it's all on this thing, speaks to his ability to groom. So does that mean there are others, or was this his first? And again, the interesting way of hiding her body makes you think this is someone who's probably thought through a process more than someone who has just all of a sudden lost themselves in a fit of rage and acts out. Although I'll tell you, it's one that, with the limited amount of information we're getting out of the island, that really could go both ways.
Most of that limited information from the island came from one person in particular, We know a lot of the information about this case because of the suspect. He apparently led investigators to her body. He confessed to it, explained what his alleged motive was. Why would he be so forthcoming when he knows he's saying that he committed this murder? Why would he just reveal all the information to investigators?
Yeah, so again, you kind of have to think about, and I wasn't on the interview, so I don't know what his behavior was there. You have two ends of the spectrum. You have the predator who wants to be known. They live such mundane lives that can you imagine that somehow being a murderer would at least put your stake in the sand and make your name known to people. So you have to consider there might be there's a chance it could be someone like that. Or it could be someone who really did groom online or in person an individual, and things fell apart and they reacted, perhaps overreacted, and we know it's an overreaction except for the fact that maybe he didn't plan on killing her, but things just started getting out of control, and then he committed the homicide. And maybe, and I always say that, I'm going to say it one more time, maybe there's a sliver of hope that he actually has a conscience and he gave up the information because he really thought, what have I done?
There are other hints left behind at the crime scene and from Sundar's confession that point to more of a heat of the moment murder rather than a premeditated scheme he'd planned out for weeks. Apparently, he told investigators that he had planned to cut up her body. I saw this in at least one report. He planned to cut up her body. It didn't work out. He ended up half burying her, whatever it may be. That, again, does that bolster your idea that this was a last minute thing? He potentially snapped. It's not like he had this planned out and had a murder kit ready to go hidden in the bushes, but it kind of was a last minute, last ditch effort to cover his tracks.
Yeah, so I think you're really hitting on something important. And again, we have to think about if in fact this is an organized predator whose plan is to go in, commit this homicide, and then dispose of the body. And in this particular case, with the scenario you've painted, mutilate the body and dissect it and move the body parts to different locations. An organized offender would come prepared to do that. But a disorganized offender is not going to be thinking, I need to take an axe or a shovel, or I got to have plastic bags, or all of those things are going to be much more challenging when all of a sudden they're thinking, how do I wash my hands of this mess that I've created? And, when you think about things like the clothing being removed or others, again, I just think it speaks to the disorganization. It could be a rudimentary method of trying to avoid detection. um, I don't know what the number of ethnicities and populations are in that area, but I would think if a missing girl who was light skinned is found buried in a hole, they're going to probably put two and two together. So it's not like you're burying someone who seems indigenous to the community that you could somehow get away with. So even removing the clothes just keeps going back to this idea that this thing just didn't pan out the way that this individual wanted. And it's a really cool time to kind of teach a principle, and that is that predators fantasize about committing crimes. And that fantasy could be very short in duration, or it could extend over months and months as they think about all of this. But the thing about fantasy is always cooler than reality. Reality always will fall short of what your fantasy is, whether it's someone fantasizing that one day I'm going to be on Law and Crime and get to talk about what's going on out there, or about being a rock star, that it's always going to fall short. And for a predator, when they think this is going to be just this great experience, and all of a sudden the victim's crying for their mother, or they're screaming for help, or they're kicking and punching, the fantasy goes out the window. So we can see even someone who comes into this organized at first become disorganized because the whole fantasy fell apart.
For the crime of Zaliya's murder, Sundar faces a lengthy prison sentence. According to Mauritius statute, he'll spend at least 60 years behind bars, if not life. As for Zaliya, her body is being sent back to Russia to be put to rest with her family. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.